Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
We've reached the last day, and we've saved the best to last. And it's a great pleasure for me to introduce Jeff Dozier, who started all this fourth paradigm stuff many, many years ago with Jim Gray in the 90s, actually. So it was a long time ago, and they produced the first website with geographic information. It was called TerraServer. And Jim Gray tried very hard to excite some people in the business groups in Microsoft to take on TerraServer. And we even had a little company we paid to produce a browser for it. But we couldn't get anybody interested. And then Google bought that company, Keyhole Technologies, and made Google Earth. And we gave them data from TerraServer for Google Earth. So actually Jim and Jeff created Google Earth. Not one of Microsoft's greatest accomplishments, I have to say. So it's a great pleasure to introduce Jeff. Every time I meet him, I find something more obscure facts. I mean, I learnt last time that he spent his 21st birthday in jail in Chamonix in France. He goes climbing with the hardest guys in English climbing, and there's a rock in Yosemite called Dozier's Dome, which is one of the climbing places. And what I learned this time was that Jeff is extremely useful to the CIA because he's a world expert on the Hindu Kush and the Khyber Pass in Afghanistan, where he used to go climbing regularly in his youth. So what he's going to tell us today is to do, I'm reminded of a novel. I don't know if you know the movie. It's called Smiller's Sense of Snow. It was set in Denmark and Greenland, and Smiller was related to the Inuit, and they have about 7 different words for snow, at least. And it was about the types of snow. Well, Jeff knows many more types of snow, and he's going to tell you about water from the mountains, the fourth paradigm, and the color of snow. Jeff.
Well, my apologies for taking long to set up. But at least I'm not trying to plug in my PowerPoint and get it working. So I'm going to start. I have 3 slides to explain what I mean by this title of Water for the Mountains and the Fourth Paradigm and the Color of Snow. So water from the mountains is important to about 20% of Earth's population. Over 1 billion people depend on snowmelt and a little bit from melt from glaciers for their water supply. So in this slide, the blue areas are those that are where most of the water comes from snowmelt, and the areas that are outlined in red are those that in addition have limited reservoir storage capacity. And so therefore the snowpack is in fact the reservoir. And most of my work in California goes on in a mountain range that we call the Sierra Nevada, but I know that in Colombia the Sierra Nevada means something in a different place. And so it turns out worldwide I know there are at least 5 Sierras Nevada. 3 of them in South America, 1 in California, and 1 in Spain, and perhaps more. And so, of course, that word simply means snowy mountain range, so it's not actually a very original way to name mountains. But so most of my discussion today on the Sierra Nevada means the Sierra Nevada in California. Right? Now, when I talk to hydrologists and people who study climate, I have to explain this book, The Fourth Paradigm. But I think in this audience I don't have to. That I've seen this slide already in 4 different presentations, so I won't necessarily go into it. But this book was to honor Jim Gray, who was lost at sea 4 years ago, and his lecture that he gave to our National Academy of Sciences just 2 weeks before he disappeared outlined this fourth paradigm of science. But other people in this meeting have talked about this book and this fourth paradigm. And I think the only thing I would say that would be different is that part of this fourth paradigm, when we start looking at data-intensive science, that some of that is not necessarily driven by hypotheses, but is simply going and looking at data and seeing that patterns emerge. And then another part of it was really covered in Phil Bourne's lecture on the fact of sharing data and making analyses of those data and then making those available. And then probably the part of the title of my talk that was most puzzling, if you had read the program, was this idea of the color of snow. And my youngest child, when I was preparing this, he kind of looked at my laptop and he said, what is there to say about the color of snow? Well, it turns out, of course, that in the visible part of the spectrum, snow is white. And if you see, these are images from the Landsat satellite, and what you see on the left-hand image, which is using the wavelength bands in the visible part of the spectrum, is that snow is white and not very easy to distinguish from clouds. But if our eyes were sensitive out in the infrared, the near-infrared part of the spectrum, snow is one of the most colorful substances in nature. And if you see on the right-hand image that if we look at those wavelength bands, that snow and clouds are distinctly colored. And so if you could see out in that part of the spectrum, snow would be as vivid as the changing colors of leaves as we go through the season. Okay, so if we get back to the water from the mountains problem, one of the things that we have to do if our reservoir is the snowpack, that we want to have some idea of how much water is going to come down the rivers when the snow melts. So one of the mechanisms for doing this is we use what we call a snow pillow, which is either a bladder or a stainless steel sandwich that is filled with a antifreeze solution, and we can measure the pressure of the overlying snow on that pillow, and therefore we have some idea of how much snow there is. And the way we define the snow is what we call the snow-water equivalent. So we're interested not only just in the depth of snow, but how much water will actually result when that snow melts. And so if we can measure the pressure from the overlying snow, then we can estimate what that snow-water equivalent is. And this is what the data look like from one of these snow pillows in my Sierra Nevada. And you can see that, first of all, there's a lot of it. Notice that the vertical axis is in millimeters of water. So that snowpack, when it melts in 2006, would have resulted in a depth of 2.5 meters of water. So it is a lot of water. And then notice the 2011. This is what the snow pillow read on the 13th of May, which when I was starting to put this talk together. And you can see that it's still snowing in our Sierra Nevada, and we're waiting for the melt. And then notice in the right-hand slides, what I've done is take those pressure readings from the snow pillows and taken the daily differences, and therefore the black represents snowfall and the red represents snow melt. And this shows what's really important about the snowpack reservoir, in that we have a long season starting in October in our northern hemisphere, and the snow falls in a set of storms, and then starting in April or perhaps May, that's just when the demand for water really increases because of agriculture, then that snow starts to melt. We also have measurements that have been taken now in the Sierra starting in 1910 of manual measurements of the snowpack, where we stick a tube in the snow, we weigh that tube, we subtract the weight of the tube itself, and then we know what the weight of the snow is. And so these are very good jobs. These people are paid to ski around in the backcountry during the winter, and there's very low turnover. Okay, and then what we do with those data is in February we start to make forecasts of when how much runoff we're going to get, and in February those forecasts have a big error bound, because some of that runoff is going to come from snow that has not fallen yet. But as we go through the season, and particularly by the time we get into April, that forecast is in fact based on snow that's already in the ground. And so as you see, the error bounds on that forecast start to narrow. And as you can see this year, this is what the forecast is, we're looking at runoff that is considerably greater than the historical average, but not as great as the historical maximum. In other words, it's a big year, but it's not the biggest year of all time. Okay, and then the question is, how well do we do? Well, not as well as we would expect, given that degree of instrumentation. And then if we think of this problem in other parts of the world, where we don't even have a surface network, obviously our predictions there are going to be even poorer. So what this graph shows is the horizontal axis shows the percentage of error at the absolute value, both positive and negative. And then the vertical axis shows the cumulative distribution function. So what you see here is that if you look at 50% on the cumulative distribution function, that the median error is about 20% of the runoff. But then if you go up to 80% on the CDF axis, you can see that error is about 40%. So that means that 20% of the time, 1 year out of 5, we're going to make an error of 40% or more. In other words, these statistical methods of estimating the runoff based on what's on the snow pillows, any method that's based on statistics is going to work well most of the time, but it's going to miss many of these outlying years. So one of the problems then we face in trying to use statistics to plan for the future is that these statistical relationships were developed during a period when the climate was changing. And what you see in this slide is that going back to a year, 1,000 years ago, that most of the proxy estimations of climate give us a temperature of about a degree or so lower than what the current temperature is. And especially as we get, if you notice, to about the year 1600, that these various measurements of estimating historical temperatures start to converge because we have more data. We now have, we do temperatures from boreholes, for example, to get at past climates. And then you can see the black line is the instrumental record. And what we have is a significant change in the climate during the period where we've developed these statistical relationships. And of course, what we say about this is this is the end of stationarity, because our statistics then are going to be less reliable as we go into the future, and particularly what we show in the various colored lines on the right side of the graph are the various projections for climate change. So what has this meant in the mountains if we look at the historical trend? This is work by a former student of mine, Danny Marks, in the Reynolds Creek watershed in Idaho. And what this shows is that the elevation of the rain-snow boundary has gone up by about 400 meters during the last 50 years. And what this means for the watershed is, in 1968 on the left-hand diagram, that blue shading shows what was really the snow-dominated part of the watershed, and in 2006 that snow-dominated part of the watershed has shrunk considerably. Okay, and then this graph takes a long time to explain, so I'm going to go fairly briefly. So what these dots show is the trend over the last 50 to 70 years for the April 1st snowpack at a variety of places, with latitude shown on the horizontal axis and elevation shown on the vertical axis. And the big red dots are ones in which have had a significant decline in snow cover over that 50-year period. And notice that all of those are at the lower elevations. That is, are below that line that really shows the elevation and latitude of a zero trend in snow cover. So what's happening, therefore, is that while we're trying to estimate the snowpack over time is shifting to higher elevations. And so what we want to do is have a much more physically based method of estimating what's going on in the snowpack, one that doesn't depend so much on statistical relationships. And so now let's see if the color of snow can help us. So if we look at the optical properties of both ice and water, ice shown in the solid blue line, the left-hand diagram shows what we call the index of refraction, which tells how light will bend as it passes the interface between air and water. And you know that if you're trying to point at a fish that's in the water, it turns out that where the fish actually is different than where you would see where it is. But across the solar spectrum, which is shown on the horizontal axis, that goes from about 0.4 of a micrometer out to 2.5 micrometers, that when we look at the index of refraction, there's not a lot of change. There's enough to get a rainbow. But if we look at the absorption coefficient, which is given, it's the value of k in this equation, that is, what's the rate at which light decays as it goes into a pure material, that notice that now the y-axis is logarithmic. And over the wavelengths of the solar spectrum, the absorption by ice and by water varies by 8 orders of magnitude. And whether we understand numbers or not, 8 orders of magnitude sounds like a big variation, yeah? Okay. And so one way of trying to characterize what that variation is I calculated in the right-hand graph what is called the E-folding distance. That is, if the argument to the I set the distance for which the argument to the exponential function is -1. All right. So, and notice that in the visible part of the spectrum, that is the left end of the right-hand graph, that E-folding distance is tens of meters. And you know this. If you go diving in clear water, you can see a long way. Yeah? And similarly, if you were frozen into bubble-free ice, you would be able to see a long way. it wouldn't do you much good. Whereas when you go out to the longer wavelengths of the solar spectrum, that E-folding distance drops by orders of magnitude, and out at 2 micrometers, for example, that E-folding distance is only 100 micrometers, right? Only 1/10 of a millimeter. So how do we use that information? Well, we look at different kinds of snow, and as Smilla did in the novel. And what we see in the left-hand slide is a typical snowflake when it falls out of the sky. And Professor Nakaya, who started the famous Institute of Low Temperature Science at Hokkaido University in Japan, did a lot of experimental work on how these snowflakes form. But now what happens after the snow falls and is in the snowpack, there are various processes that change the shape of that snowflake and cause the flakes to bond together. And so if we look at the right-hand image, this is an electron microscope photograph of what snow grains in the pack look like. And so what we do is we take those calculations of the optical properties of ice, and we do what's called a radiative transfer model. That is, we figure out how much is being scattered by each grain, and that's a famous computationally intensive problem. That is, the equations to do that were developed in 1908, and the capacity to solve them came around in 1980. But what we can do then is estimate the reflectivity of snow as a function of its optical properties and the way the grains change during the seasons. And so now we learn about how the color of snow changes as the properties of snow change. So what we see is in the visible part of the spectrum, where ice is so transparent. So what I'm showing on this graph is, on the right-hand axis, I'm showing that absorption coefficient that we showed earlier, and on the left-hand axis and all those lines, I show what the spectral reflectivity of snow is as it changes with the size of the grain. And what we see is that in the visible spectrum, because ice is so transparent, that there's very little change with the grain size, right? So it's white because it's transparent. So that's why if a child asks you, where does the white go when the snow melts? You can say, well, the individual grain is not white, it's transparent. It's the same thing with gray hair. That if you look at a hair in a microscope, gray hair is transparent. Right? Okay, but when we get into the wavelengths where ice is moderately absorptive, then the size of the grain makes a difference. And why that is important is about half of the solar energy at Earth's surface is in wavelengths beyond the visible. And so therefore, when we try to calculate how much energy the snow is absorbing, we need to worry about that problem. Now, in the visible part of the spectrum, we get change in the reflectivity because of dust and soot, and a little bit from these red algae that live in the snow. And so, in that case, if we look at the spectrum of snow for both the dust and the red algae, we see that those cause changes in the reflectivity in the visible. So where snow doesn't appear white is typically in the spring when it gets dirty. And so if you look at the amount of solar radiation absorbed, this is at my instrument site on Mammoth Mountain where I live and I ski every day and things like that. The left-hand diagram shows both the incoming solar radiation and the reflected solar radiation. And then the top diagram on the right takes the ratio of those, and that's the reflectivity, or what we call the albedo of the snow. And what we see is during the year that that albedo bumps up when we have a storm because we get these nice new snowflakes, but that there's a downward trend in the albedo through the season. And therefore, the lower right diagram shows the net solar radiation that the snow has absorbed. And you'll note that that increases more rapidly than the incoming radiation. So two things are happening in the spring. One is we're getting more sunlight, and that's what causes spring and what causes summer. But in addition, that snow is getting a little darker. So not only are we getting more sunlight, but we're getting a bigger fraction of that sunlight being absorbed. Okay, so I can measure what's going on at a spot in the snow, but I'm interested in what happens in snow over the whole mountain range, and I'm really interested in what happens in snow in every mountain range on Earth. And so in order to make those kinds of observations, we have to back up to satellite. So Harold Javid, in his talk yesterday, described the MODIS instrument that flies on the Terra satellite. And so this sort of shows how a satellite orbits. The orbit is constant, and the Earth is rotating underneath the orbit. And so therefore, as it makes multiple orbits, it sees different spots on the Earth's surface. So MODIS is the instrument that is on this satellite. It's got a fairly wide field of view, and in 2 days it sees all of Earth's surface. And in fact, in 1 day it sees almost all of Earth's surface, particularly at the higher latitudes where the snow is. So MODIS has 36 different spectral bands, and what this shows is the horizontal axis shows the wavelength in those bands, and then the vertical axis shows the spatial resolution at Earth's surface. So 2 of the bands are at 250 meters, a bunch more, 5 more are at 500 meters, and then the rest of them are at 1 kilometer. And then the ones that are sort of on the left-hand side of the diagram, those depend on radiation that is coming from the sun, and so we only collect data in those bands when we're on the sunlit part of the Earth. The ones on the right-hand side are in the thermal infrared, and they're measuring the radiation that Earth is emitting, and so those operate both on the daylit side of the Earth and also on the dark side of the Earth. Okay, so now what can we do? So if we look at the spectral reflectivity of different things on Earth, what we see is that in the upper right-hand diagram we see the various kinds of snow. In the upper left-hand diagram we see reflectance for various kinds of vegetation, and the lower left we see for various kinds of soil. And then what the lower right-hand diagram shows is if we take one of those spectra from each group, as just to illustrate what's going on, and what we notice is that snow is quite different than both vegetation and soil. Snow is the substance that is bright in the visible part of the spectrum, but pretty dark when we get out into the near infrared. And then superimposed on that lower right diagram are the spectral bands for the MODIS instrument. Now, MODIS, we get data every day, but those data are at 500 meter resolution. And so, and you know, in the mountains, in 500 meters, you'll see a lot of change. And so what we want to do then is we do what is called a spectral unmixing algorithm. That is, we try to solve for each pixel how much of that pixel is composed of snow, of various kinds of snow, and how much is vegetation and how much is soil. And that's both a data-intensive problem and a computationally intensive problem. But what we end up with, if we take the MODIS image on the left, what we can ascertain from that image is the concentration of what we call a set of n members that's shown on the right. So on the right, the deep blue is all snow, the deep red is bare soil, and the really deep green is vegetation. Okay, so then what we can do is, again for the Sierra Nevada, the elevations are shown on the left-hand image. The MODIS image is shown in the middle. And then on the right, we show what fraction of each of those grid cells is in fact covered with snow. And then not only can we estimate how much of it is covered with snow, but we can also estimate which of the snow end members best fits that pixel. So now we know what the grain size is of the snow, and we also therefore know its reflectivity, its albedo, how much of the solar radiation is being reflected. And so, okay, so now my question is, at a given spot I can measure how much snow there is, and from the satellite I can measure what parts of the area are covered with snow. And then the question is, in order to get a better forecast of the snowmelt runoff, I would really like to get a spatial distribution of how much snow there is. I'd like to be able to estimate how much snow there is at every grid cell. All right? So this is a picture of that variable, but what do we do to make that picture correct? I mean, it's easy enough, with computers, we can make a picture. Okay? And we can color it however we want. But then the question is, well, how do we do this in a way that picture actually means something? That is, a picture is in fact showing geophysical variables. Okay, so there's three independent ways that I can get at that picture. One is I can simply do a spatial interpolation from the measurements that I have at the surface. But if you do that, if you just take the spatially distributed data and you apply your favorite 2- or 3-dimensional interpolation algorithm to it, you'll spread snow out into California's Central Valley and even out to the ocean. And the reason is those measurements don't tell you necessarily where the snowpack goes to zero. So what you can do is do an interpolation, but you can use the remote sensing measurements to constrain that interpolation. Okay, so that's one way of doing it. It's a statistical method, uses data. Another way is to try to do a model. And so there's a model called the SNODAS, the Snow Data and Assimilation System. And it's also called the National Snow Model. And so what this tries to do is combine numerical weather models with a snowmelt model, with surface data, and with remote sensing, and try to use as many things as we have to estimate the amount of snow. And then another way of measuring it is what's called a reconstruction. So the one thing I can tell from the satellite images is when the snow goes away. And then what I can do is using my knowledge of solar radiation and temperature and things like that, I can estimate the rate at which that snow has been melting, and by knowing when it goes away, I can figure out how much there was. So this, we think, is the most accurate method of doing it, except it gives us the answer after the snow is gone. So that in itself is not very useful, because when the snow is gone, I can just see what's in the river, and I know how much water we've gotten. So one of the reasons for those kinds of differences is that the distribution of snow is heterogeneous. What's different between snow and rain? Well, obviously one big difference is rain is wet, and snow is not. But the other difference is that snow moves around on the ground after it falls. And that heterogeneity is really important. So in this picture, the snow is varying just over a few hundred meters it's varying from about 50 centimeters in depth to about 3 meters. And those trees, they've figured out where that snow is going to be, and that's where they've decided to grow. In other words, this heterogeneity causes late season soil moisture to be available for plants, so it's important in the ecological sense. And it also changes the rate of melt, because if you're piling, if you have snow that is uniform, it's going to melt much earlier than snow that is piled up somewhere. So getting at this heterogeneity, it both affects our ability to measure, but it also is important to know. So let me go a little bit more into this reconstruction that a couple of my students have worked on. And that is, if we have the snow cover, and it's fractionally, let's say we start out with the snow completely covering, then we calculate that rate of melt, and then as the fraction of snow has shrunk as we go through the season, what we end up with by calculating that rate of melt is the reconstructed snow. We know something about the heterogeneous deposition of snow within that grid cell. Yeah, so that's cool, right? Okay, now this is data intensive science. So this is kind of just an illustration of one of the variables that goes into that calculation. So we start on the upper left with solar radiation over a fairly coarse scale based on cloud cover measurements from satellite. We spatially smooth that. We then correct it for elevation, and then work that I've done is to correct for the topography, that is the different slopes that the radiation is on. We then do a correction for vegetation, because in a forest the solar radiation at the surface of the snow is going to be much different. Then we correct for the fact that we've got reflectivity of that snow, and then we finally end up on the lower right with estimating how much energy has actually gone during that hour into melting that snow. So over this area we're looking at images, essentially looking at every hour. Okay, and we do pretty well with this. That is completely from measurements with no surface calibration at all. We can reproduce the measurements that are at the snow pillows. So we have some confidence that this is a good idea. Okay, so now but again, the problem is this reconstruction, it's pretty accurate, but it's after the fact. So here's my problem, that the left-hand image and the middle image are ways where I can get at the amount of snow in real time. Let me put up a scale there. And the one on the right, which I think is the one that is the correct answer, I get after the fact. So my problem, and I haven't solved it, I'm giving it to you, right? My problem is, can I use that information on the right to better improve those two models that are on the left and the middle? Okay, and so this is, in this data-intensive science, I think this is an example of a data mining problem. And so if we go through the year, we see that this is June, and particularly what we see in the reconstruction methods is when we get out to July, there's still a fair amount of snow in that watershed. And that turns out to be very important, because now I've got a reservoir full of water, and do I need to hang on to that water so the people in San Francisco will have something to drink in October, or can I let some of that water out and generate hydroelectric power, which I can sell for about $125,000 a day or something like that. And to know that, having knowledge of how much snow is still left in the watershed, it would be a really important thing to know. And then you can see in August, there's, again, the reconstruction and the visible data show there's still snow in the watershed, even though all of those surface measurements have shown no snow at all. Okay, so that was just going back to April. So I have an idea about how to solve this problem. And one of the things that you might be interested in is I plan to crowdsource this. That is, I'm going to put these data out there. And if any of you have a good idea, then you'll have plenty of data to try to play with it. So this is another way of portraying the differences between those models. So what this has is the time scale, the months on the horizontal axis, the elevations on the vertical axis, and this shows how much snow each of these models is showing in each of the elevation bands. And note that the reconstruction just starts when snow starts to melt. So that's why it's cut off on the left-hand side. And then this next diagram shows the same thing, except now I've translated each of those to a depth of snow, an average depth of snow in that elevation band. And notice that the reason it shifts upward when I do that second calculation is there's deeper snow at the higher elevations, but there's less area at the higher elevations, and so the volume integral is less. So I plan to do this. I'm figuring out there's some of the software we need to rerun for some of the reconstruction because we've got some better methods, but I want to put this out there for you all to have at. Okay, and the reason, again, that this reconstruction works better is if we look, is this persistent high elevation snowpack. So notice in this image in July, there's a fair amount of snow in the watershed, but all of the measurements are below the place where the snow exists. And that's, in this particular watershed, that's about 300 square kilometers of snow. So this brings us back to the fourth paradigm. That I think that just as we think of publications as being a cycle, where you write a paper and it goes through the review process and eventually it gets published, and now that paper becomes input for my paper. And we're thinking, I think Phil Bourne covered a little bit of this in his lecture, that the same thing happens with data. That we acquire data from the satellite. I get the data from the satellite. And I have devoted a long time to understanding those data. There's all sorts of arcane things you need to know about satellite data in order to get information out of it. But I can go through those data in this cycle, and I can turn them into something that is more easily interpretable and therefore available to a wider audience. And so part of our task in this to make the fourth paradigm really useful is a mechanism for making the data part of the publication cycle. And I think Phil covered that from the biological perspective in his lecture very well. Okay, because one of the things, we don't do this very well yet. In general, at least in the environmental sciences, the raw data are pretty available. You can go out to any agency's website, you can download data, you can go to NASA, you can get the MODIS data, they're free. But data really become more useful as we go up this this information ladder where we synthesize data, we aggregate it, we do spatial analyses, and with a few, there are some counterexamples of where people have done this very well, but by and large, in the environmental sciences, we don't do this very well. NASA has, I think, been one of the agencies to do this well, in that from the MODA satellite, there's a whole range of information products you can get out of that, but they haven't solved the authorship problem. That is, if you have a new product that you want to put into this system, or a revision of one of the existing products, it's not easy to do. And so I think that's part of our task, to make data-intensive science much more useful. Okay, we've come to the end. I tried to get through Finnegan's Wake when I was an undergraduate, and this is about what I remember, as Finnis being the author of all books, because his name is at the end. My acknowledgments, University of California, Santa Barbara. It's right on the ocean. It's been a wonderful place to think about snow and ice for many years. My funding agencies, NASA, NSF, NGA, NOAA, Army Cold Regions Lab, and the California Department of Water Resources. And then this is probably the only slide I know where Mammoth Mountain and Microsoft are acknowledged in the same in the same slide. And then, of course, all of us in academia owe much to collaborations with our students. And these are my PhD students. So thank you very much.